legislation. This week, with our legislative acknowledgement constitutional right, we want to listen to the constitutional act that acknowledges the communication office, that are the office business that acknowledges all different countries. We don't only today want to focus on a communication line that acknowledges one country in its acknowledgement, but today me, Ribea Elise, want to refer to the constitutional act that are the constitutional right for the business acknowledgement communication line to be legislatively acknowledged in all that the office business acknowledge. And when we look today at all that the office business acknowledge in its day, in its year, and we look at my Evoke business that began its journey not necessarily when I started employment in a human resource office acknowledgement, but acknowledging the complete womb responsibility when we introduce today not only school color acknowledgement, but when we give birth in a hospital, when we today look at all the television satellite ad by the Star Communication, not limited to the Star acknowledgement only, but then therefore according to Genesis 1 verse 7, all acknowledgement responsibility, right? And when the constitutional right gives countries a right to acknowledge the office business under its communication office that it communicates at whilst holding business in our years, right? Whilst the business are a business in our years, right? And when countries have to decide today on who they decide to contact on the communication line, and the communication line acknowledges its business responsibility, that acknowledges the next business that stands in line next to it, that acknowledges the next business that stands in line next to it, that acknowledges all that we learn in primary school under the 1+1+1+1+1 communication line that acknowledges the office business communication line, right? And I've mentioned it on our Evoke Instagram, cell phone media pages, the 1+1+1 communication line, that our legislative acknowledgement responsibility when we today look at the Computerized Act that solely stands under the office business communication line that acknowledges the business responsibility. And when we today acknowledge that the Computerized Act today introduces a computer to another computer, introduces a business to another business, then we acknowledge the complete the office business responsibility under the constitutional right that all countries have to hold business under the 1+1 communication line that acknowledges all businesses that holds business under or that have business in acknowledgement to the communication line, right? And when the communication line are today not only the Computerized Act in its responsibility, and the communication line under the Computerized Act are not only a responsibility for businesses that holds business in an office to then learn to legislatively adhere to their responsibility in the office business communication line, and the business today for me, Queen Ribea Elise, our business at home, and it forms part of the same business communication line, and we don't want interferences in the communication line. We don't want, like we've mentioned on our cell phone media pages, and our Twitter tweets, we don't want New Zealand government and police to shout into the communication line. Has they done it in other businesses in the country? I yet do not know, in accordance to the health and safety report that then there from the Legislative Court of Law would then be submitted to the White House of America under its policing communication responsibility that it has under the office business communication line, right? And this morning we heard New Zealand police once again, and they normally want you to shout back in the house or to swear back in the house, and there's no one around you in the house, and only you realize it's them, right? It's a police communication line that forms part of the household's business office communication line that Evoke business are a business as introduced on all cell phone media pages acknowledgement. And when governments have to acknowledge the communication line, and when Africa have been sitting for years business in poverty because this was done in Africa, right? When you see today that New Zealand police realize how to manipulate a business communication line in a little business like my Evoke business that are quite a bright Queen Mum Universe and a George Throne fashion communication line, telephone line, computerized office in a Chinese country that China designs the dresses, and you can see in the design when Queen Sana George behind the designs in accordance to the Star communication line that it's quite in legislative acknowledgement and responsibility, right? That it's not only a dress that I wear, it's not only a shirt, but it's designed in accordance to acknowledging the complete womb's responsibility in our years, right? And when we look at Africa today, that had police communications that are different countries' police communications that sways into Africa, that sways into African countries, that makes your business wait for a communication to come through in the international communication line, that then after the computerized communication line forms part of a telephone line that someone have to contact your business at, right? When police today south into African countries, in the computerized communication line, there are telephone signal that certain countries have to contact certain countries in Africa for the business communication to therefore be acknowledging the business communication, right? So in America, the African Americans arrived. In America, they were staying for many, many years. In America, the business communication that they hold under the office business acknowledges the business communication line that their family wombs are part of in the African continent, right? And then therefrom, the communication line are then in acknowledgement to its to legislative responsibility. So who do we blame today for Africa being in poverty? Most countries realize that it was a policing disturbance, that only the police have access in that communication that they sought into your house at, that the Chinese government have given only them access, and then therefrom the Chinese government normally do its investigation under the constitutional right that a country has to be a fair country and to be a safe country in acknowledgement to its legislative responsibility, right? And when we today look at a business that was meant to be a business in Africa also, and the business communication line were not yet acknowledged in its complete acknowledgement office, right? Then we today look at someone wanting to point the finger to someone else in our journey, right? And when we today have to be direct in acknowledgement that I educate on my Evoke Purpose serving page, that I'm kindly very direct in acknowledging where my season are meant to be at, right? Where my communication office are meant to be at. Who's responsible to contact me in the communication line, right? Who's responsible to acknowledge my Evoke business in all that the communication line have introduced in these 20 years, right? And it was quite a introduction under my 40-year journey book, apostrophe the introduction, journey communication line under New Orleans Secondary School's legislative responsibility to acknowledge where I'm at in Auckland, New Zealand, to acknowledge who they open my communications in school to acknowledge who they allow to south into my human body while I'm sitting in Auckland, New Zealand, to acknowledge the communication line that were acknowledged at New Orleans Secondary School that my brother King Richard Philander were deceased in under the communication line office that New Orleans Secondary School in South Africa had a legislative responsibility, right? Today, South African police can also shout into this New Zealand house, and it's a Jerome Crot shouting, and it's a South African police and a New Zealand police shouting into our womb, into our house's communication, and it's quite confusing, right? And countries today, in all that we learn, have a constitutional right to represent the legislative representation that acknowledges the business office representation when your business presents and represents in its years, right? When your business introduces in its years, when your business adheres to its legislative responsibility in its years, right? When your business acknowledges that the country have a right to be a fair, safe country for all its people, right? When the business computerized communication line acknowledges the policing responsibility that forms part of the business communication line, that the police can make contact to you in your business telephone or communication line, and right? And when the communication line in New Zealand today are so manipulated that people have to find their way in the international world, in New Zealand are the very first Monday in its responsibility, and the computers still go in satellite on all the international countries after the day of New Zealand sunshine are done, then the same computerized communication that were acknowledged in New Zealand's the office business are then acknowledged in all different countries, right? And when New Zealand today looks quiet, other international countries today find the press of the communication line. Me, Ribea Elise in New Zealand today realize how New Zealand police are actually manipulating the communication line. Why the earth are actually feeling so oppressed and aggressed under its years. There are such acknowledgement years, right? Why countries today find themselves in so much poverty when the country New Zealand looks quiet. When me, Queen Ribea Elise, open my grocery cupboard numerous times now in this New Zealand house, that the grocery cupboard by the second week of monthly payment, then the calculation by New Zealand's government's IRD payroll have not calculated the groceries that the house are meant to have for a complete month, right? And when New Zealand get the computerized calculation so wrong, and I have to find my way through it, and my husband works hard and he does not worry when there's nothing or when there's only rice, and only India sends their 5 kg bag of rice in, like me, Queen Ribea Elise, used to shop in South Africa when we were a big family, 10 kg rice, 3 pockets of potatoes, the complete calculation in all accuracy, because we work hard in employment and because it's under the office business acknowledgement, right? When New Zealand IRD today offers manipulate the computerized communication that the house's groceries can't even calculate for a complete 4 weeks. The groceries nowadays only calculate for 2 weeks, and then my husband goes in all his educational journeys that he have worked under the computerized office in Rico, in Nashua, South Africa many years, that the calculation should in actual fact be there for the Legislative Court of Law would say in the Calculation Act in all accuracy in accordance to the household that has to be provided for and that has a right to be provided for in the country, right? When IRD calculation under the Grocery Act calculation do our house's calculation so wrong, and they the whole time want to divert the calculation to Sal Holtman at Nibblybits that now have moved and are not yet anymore at Nibblybits. Nibblybits has closed its office and they have changed its name in South Africa. And when the calculations act under the Woolworths grocery store that Nibblybits were also manufacturing under, right? The accreditation right for Nibblybits to have then therefore held business under the Woolworths accreditation right that acknowledge Queen Maminivis and a George behind the throne whom that acknowledge all households born in the womb in its calculation accuracy that were then sometimes maybe deprived of processes of the computerized communication, then at Nibblybits have received a right to have their right communication line. And when Woolworths New Zealand today, Woolworths South Africa today manipulate the calculation and the computerized communication so much under the Calculation Act, and the house today forms part of a business communication line, and the police today finds a way to also manipulate it further. The hospital computerized communication also finds its way through David Beckham's tamper advert to manipulate the communication line further under the hospital bed that you normally were hospitalized at Middlemore Hospital when me, Queen Ribea Elise, gave birth at Middlemore Hospital in the year 2005 under the Computerized Act. That David Beckham's tamper advert arrived in New Zealand also and was in New Zealand playing behind television scenes and was only introduced while me, Queen Ribea, reported the sightings in my house, right? And the presence in my house, then the computerized communication sent the advert through, that the advert were playing behind the scenes in my house's communication, and it has caused me to shout so loud in the house, right? And when the hospital bed that you gave birth and the calculations act, that all the babies in the hospitals are calculated at on the day that you give birth, the household provision that the house have a right to be provided for under the Computerized Act, that are the computer that acknowledges you, the mama, that have given birth to the baby in the country, not limited to the country, the Legislative Court of Law would say, whilst you have traveled to the country and the immigration right are to then therefore give the right information. If you have children on your journey and you arrived in the country on her visa, then you have a right to give the right accurate information, right? And while the information were given to Immigration New Zealand, and while the Computerized Act were now in New Zealand manipulated in me, Ribea Elise, there's so many numerous of times, and countries have a right to do right under the Calculations Act that still forms part of the Business Office New Zealand, that still forms part of the International Business Office, that then still forms part of other households in other poverty countries that still have to be provided for under the same communication line. Countries that still have to be provided for under the same communication line. when the Calculation Act were manipulated in New Zealand. The Calculation Act includes the Compterized Act that acknowledges your business under the Office Business Telephone Line, Computerized Communication Line. When New Zealand manipulated the Calculations Act in my day so much, my day forms part of so many people in poverty that were just waiting on my human resource communication to be acknowledged under the Computerized Act so that their households have a right to can then be provided for under the right that they have to be provided for, right? And while so many countries were following the communication line, were monitoring my human resource journey, were writing films, thank you Kyria Lik in the Turkish film that wrote that while me, Queen Ribea Elise, were a waitress, right? And my hair was meant to be as blonde as Daphne in the film's hair, and I was introduced in fashion in Oostenburg Lodge, and I was a waitress in Denise Bailey with the blonde hair communication was then acknowledged under the communication, while Queen Sana George Philander had a right to be acknowledged, right? And when the Kyria Lik film team writes their films for me so in all accuracy, in all thoroughness, in all that they have responsibility being television employees under the Office Business Acknowledgement, right? The film arrived in COVID-19 in South Africa in 2020. Me, Queen Ribea Elise or Ribea Elise, stayed in South Africa for a year under the Computerized Act, right? To then acknowledge the film's responsibility that they have to communicate to me under the circumstances that they have been introduced to when they were excited to walk the journey with me, like they've learned about District 6 that looks also like their European parts and countries, and like they were excited to follow the journey's educational journey, they then had a right to listen to where the computerized communication are at, but with me in the day that I find myself, you know. And while Mrs. Binanchinet like to say, you know, and while the Computerized Act have a right to then acknowledge countries that are still waiting on the same communication line that you are sometimes maybe employed in your office on, right? And then it's not only a communication line, a computerized communication line, but it's a financial system, it's a financial program like we received at Niblibits that were the SARS program that provides for another country, right? And for certain people it was not only a computerized communication line, and it was only a payroll employment, and it was only a human resource office, and you were only employed for this day or that day or that day, but it's a complete computerized financial program that then has to provide for another country where you are acknowledged in your employment right at, right? Under the constitutional right for countries to be provided for. And when today we acknowledge that the communication line that are the Computerized Act acknowledges all its signals that its satellites at, that it can signal you not only on Earth, but in different parts of the star communication acknowledgement that we acknowledge under the computerized acknowledgement that are under the Computerized Act, where you as a household have a right to be provided for in all that your country access about you in its calculation, right? And when your country calculates you in, and countries do data statistics once a year, data statistics acknowledges you in the country, it acknowledges your satellite signal that are part of the country's computerized communication line, that are part of how the country are then provided for, that are part of how the country receives its information, then your house have a right to be provided for, right? Not yet only then the legislative court of law would say, not limited to this or that, but in acknowledgement to the country's responsibility that it holds under the Computerized Act, that it have to acknowledge all people in the country that has to be provided for, right? There are all people that find themselves residing in a country. And while the country has a right to uphold its constitutional right in acknowledgement under the Computerized Act, and the country have a right to acknowledge all the processes that provides for households under the Computerized Act, or grocery stores that produces the groceries, that acknowledges and that accounts your household in before it produces or manufactures the groceries, and it calculates you in, and your calculator computerized communication satellite exactly say what you, the person, would now prefer in the grocery store store, what your type of groceries are that you would come and buy, what the grocery store can manufacture for you and can produce for you. And that's only one signal that countries access about you, the human being, and its different star access, that it's got the right to access, right? Under the communications right, under the right to have a fair country, under the right to have fair processes, under the right to have a fair stay. It's fine for countries to all go into all that countries then desire to. That does not form part of the Computerized Act, but in countries' legislative responsibility, that it has to have fair processes in the international world's acknowledgement. Then the countries have a right to acknowledge your household being provided for under the Computerized Act on a daily basis, right? And today we find grocery stores that throw food in the bin on a Wednesday. We then learned about it at Nibblybits. We then learned that on a Wednesday, someone mentioned in the office, then the grocery stores normally brings their food to a price level that the household can then come and select their items. We then learned that grocery stores after then had the right to then provide the food in all acknowledgement, in all legislative responsibility, in all that Queen Ribea Elise were introduced in the Country Act, in all that Queen Ribea Elise were human resource, human rights, Queen Ribea in the womb, that all households have a right to have fair processes, to have all that they desire in the country, to be treated fairly, and to have the fair acknowledgement responsibility under the legislative right of acknowledgement. And while all countries then have learned to act right under its computerized communication line, its computerized communication line are a safe country. A safe country are a country that other people travels to, that other people come and introduce, and that other people are introduced to its country's processes. Its country's processes then therefore derive safely in other countries, right? And under such constitutional right that countries have, that learned apostrophe the introduction, that your country's computerized communication are going to be introduced to another country, and it's going to have an effect on how another country's circumstances are, then policing have a responsibility to do households right. Then legislative court of law under the constitutional right have a right to decide how they treat a policing computerized communication that does not treat a household right, that does not acknowledge a household's processes under all accuracy under the Calculations Act, that are under the Computerized Act, that are under the Constitutional Act, that are under the Legislative Right of Responsibility Act, right? And when countries today have a right to do all those green ticks right, all those green ticks arrive safely by your door, all those green ticks arrive in your grocery cupboard, all those green ticks excite you, the person in the country, whilst you are residing in a country, right? All those green ticks arrive in another country safely, in another country can then build further on the same computerized communication line, right? And then the question is, how often does such a computerized communication line that I acknowledged in New Zealand arrive in an international country by year, right? Normally in its 6 months period, in the first 6 months, normally in its 12-month period after the Computerized Act, we're copying the complete country's information. Then it normally arrives safely in another international country. Let's say another international country have a person like me, Queen Ribea Elise, in high acknowledgement authority, black in skin color, shorter hair, born in South Africa, under the complete Queen Mum Universe and a George Throne School color acknowledgement, under all its responsibility acknowledgement, whilst me, Queen Ribea Elise's house will now be deprived in New Zealand, and the Computerized Act arrived next year, the year 2027, by the month of June, July, in another country in Africa, and the person in Africa looks at the circumstances, and the country yet didn't contact the household for the employment right, for the employment communication, or for the business communication, while me, Queen Ribea Elise, acknowledged in my business officer vote, while my business officer vote are completely introduced on cell phone media, and whilst the person realized that they now exactly acknowledged under the same computerized communication, their house exactly sometimes, most of the time, look like me, Queen Ribea Elise's house in New Zealand, the business office most of the time would have the same color communication sometimes as me, Queen Ribea Ribea Elise's color communication. Sometimes we learn that we also look alike in human form, that the person would normally also look like me, Queen Ribea Elise, look like all the babies born in Africa on a daily basis, and like I've all these years look like all the babies born in Africa. And while the babies are now waiting on one computerized communication, and while New Zealand police have now manipulated this far, and while the White House of America have one right that they can legislatively acknowledge and adhere to all that they were introduced to about me on the Chinese communication line, while they are sitting in the White House of America, while they've read all my tweets on Twitter, while they've read my response in the country, while they've listened to how loud my house are in the country, while they've listened to its police, its defense force, it's the governmental parliamentary office that's manipulating the computerized communication line, and that the computerized communication line are highly sensitive. Then what can the person in Africa then do? The person in Africa then have a legislative right under the Human Rights Act to acknowledge the complete communication that were introduced in its years under the Nibblebits office computerized communication line, that are the Woolworths grocery store that were already meant to have been built in Africa at numerous parts in Africa, and the person then, or the government in Africa then, have a right to address the White House of America under its legislative right, under its right of acknowledgement that the African country have a right to have been acknowledged under the computerized communication line that me, Ribea Elise, Queen Ribea Elise, were introduced to in these years, that acknowledges the Human Resources Human Rights Act in all its responsibility, in all its legislative acknowledgement responsibility, right? And when the African continent then have a right to nowadays address the White House of America in all its acknowledgement responsibility, and while the court of law have opened, and while the decisions are addressed in accordance to the introduction at the Nibblebits KPTY Limited office that are now Interfoods, Road Foods, South Africa, Paarl Community, South African office, while the computerized communication line have safely arrived in New Zealand and have safely introduced me in the human resource offices in New Zealand and have safely introduced me in South Africa under the Computerized Communication Act, and the African continent have a right to then decide when the circumstances in me, Ribea Elise, or Queen Ribea Elise's house does not change, and I still find myself disturbed under the computerized communication line, what their rights are then to then address the matter safely, and to then therefore still have safe countries in Africa that are also acknowledged under the same computerized telephone communication line under the communication office that the Human Resource Office then introduces in its years, right? Under the subject communications that we study in human resources, and under this that we study in human resources, and under the subject communications, the office communication then educates you on how to address the matter, right? And whether to draft a letter, whether to make a telephone call, when does a country make a telephone call to a country like the White House of America, and all its acknowledgement and its right to have a fair country, even after the telephone call, even after the computerized email communication, even after contacting the White House of America, even after traveling to America to address the matter, under its legislative responsibility, then countries still have a right to then therefore have a safe country, right? Then countries like different African countries on the African continent have a right to then therefore have a safe country under the Computerized Act responsibility, under the right of acknowledgement responsibility, under the constitutional rights responsibility. So where are we at today? We're today at the subject communications, that is, how do you draft the letter, or how do you contact the legislative court of the White House of America in its responsibility, in its Human Rights Act, to then therefore ensure that countries that are dependent under the Computerized Act and a telephone communication line that builds under the office business communication line to then be treated fairly, right? And then countries then legislatively have the right to adhere to the legislative acknowledgement responsibility under the office business in its constitutional right. All that we have mentioned are today in its constitutional right. Under the statutory law, we acknowledge the law that stipulates all that have been communicated then, therefore, onwards, all that have been communicated before then, the Bible say, all that then, therefore, be communicated after, the Bible say, before then, and the currentness of our years, even then the Bible say, under the Computerized Act until all eternity, the computerized acknowledgement responsibility, there are therefore then the right of fair processes to then therefore be implemented under the constitutional right. The Bible are the biblical right from wrong that we all learn that the office business are built on, and that the office business acknowledge on the right for people to treat one another fairly. How does a wrong acknowledge a wrong? How does a right then therefore acknowledge a right in all that we learn in the biblical right from wrong? Under the legislative right from wrong, the legislative responsibility that all countries have to adhere to legislation in all that countries are acknowledged under the legislative, the office business, computerized communication line on. Then the constitutional right, the right for countries to constitutionally adhere to all that the business office acknowledges in its business right. Business office today are the houses that we stay in, like we introduced on our Vogue business. Business office are not yet only a business premises and a business in a business city, but it's today in our community where we are staying a little distance from a city, that today our normal house that forms part of the same computerized communication line, then that therefore can then also be in your house in all its computerized right, in all that our houses have introduced computers on, and under its constitutional right, under its statutory law, under the law, that's how we decide to react in its core, in accordance to all that we have been introduced to, that today are the Statue of Liberty, how we decide to react in all that we have been introduced to, the Statue of Liberty that stands in front of all the Europeans. How do we react in all that we have decided to be introduced to? Do we stand quiet and do nothing, or do we react and decide to react in a way that are right and in a way that are fair in all that we learn under the legislative court of law principle fairness, And when we today close the communication discussion under HR 2025-2026 business restructuring with me, Ribea Elise, then under the constitutional right, under the statutory law, under the law that states, under the communication right that the law communicates on, how do we then communicate in countries under the Parliamentary Act in ways that are fair, in ways that are right, in ways that are in all legislative acknowledgement, in all legislative right and acknowledgement. And therefore today, that is all that we then want to educate under our legislative right, our constitutional act, under its legislative responsibility, under its statutory law, in how we decide to react in the communication line that implements and have a right to implement fair processes in all its legislative acknowledgement, in all its legislative responsibility. And therefore, while we conclude today, next week we're going to discuss further the statutory discussion under the statutory law, under all that countries are built on, under all that countries are then therefore also acknowledged on, under all that the communication line that forms part of the builders communication line that me, Ribea Elise, were working at Bull and Build on, that are not only a Bull and build that are being built in Africa, but that are built in biblical grade acknowledgement, like I said on my WordPress, www.wordpress.wordpress.com, www.wordpress.com. The biblical business office that are today being built in Africa in our years, and that are preparing to build in Africa in our years, the biblical black and whiteness in all its acknowledgement that are built on the African continent, where the Bible would say, where there would be a nation that only wears black and white night and day, like the Bible writings are black, the Bible pages are white, in all acknowledgement to its biblical responsibility. That is where our years are at in its constitutional right. It is the African country that prepares for its great bold under the biblical right, under the biblical bold, and we therefore request that countries like New Zealand that have oppressed Africa for years today find a way to find themselves busy in their own countries, and to therefore learn that Africa are currently building further and they have a right to be non-disturbed while they are preparing under the Building Rights Act, right? And while they are preparing in the White House of America, while they are preparing under the Legislative Court of Law, while they are preparing under their constitutional right, while they are preparing under the statutory law, the law that stipulates and that has the right to then be communicated and to then arrive safely in where it's meant to be at in its years, in where it's meant to be a building at in its years in Africa, in where the African continent have a right to have fair processes built in Africa. There are all that we want to mention under today's legislative right of acknowledgement, constitutional right, statutory law, and therefore the Computerized Act that acknowledges the office business in its computerized responsibility. That is it all of you all. Have a great week. Next week we're going to talk further on before we conclude this year's discussion with HR 2025-2026 business restructuring with me, Ribea Elise.